Arcadia book on East End and East Liberty. And by the way, late this month, there will be a book on Shadyside. So all of
Hi,
the
Marvin.
names are now getting covered. In November, we're going to hear about the cable cars in Pittsburgh from one of our members who's putting a lecture together. And then in December, the Rivers of Steel is going to come and talk both about history down there in Homestead, but also they're getting closer and closer to getting approval for a National Historic Park focused on the Carey furnaces, as well as the pump house, which is right next to the waterfront, and their offices on 8th Street. Would all be part of this, and Ron Barrett is going to come and talk about that. And then after that, we pursue our planning. We now have 80, 90 members for the year. We're always glad to have more. These talks are open without being a member, but we welcome memberships at very nominal rates, and there's information in the back on that. We just finished 2 successful walking tours, and we'll do a couple more next year. And that's what we're about. And we like to do a variety of talks, and the longer we do this, because we've been having lectures now for 4 or 5 years, the more we need a variety of talks, because otherwise we use up the subject. And so this year particularly, with the 250th anniversary, we've gone a little broader afield than in the past. And our speaker tonight is going to talk to us about the Pittsburgh Pirates. There is a Squirrel Hill connection we'll hear a little about, but more generally about the Pirates. I'm going to have you introduce yourself further. No?
Sure.
Okay, tell us about what you do and all that.
Okay, my name is Dave Finoli. Actually, in my real life, I'm a personnel and operations manager with Kohl's department store. But as a hobby, a few years ago, I started writing books. I spent my whole life starting out as a pirate fan during much happier times in the late 60s, early 70s. And just had a great love of it. And as I got a little older, I decided I wanted to write some books about it. So started out by writing a book on baseball during World War II. Got the great pleasure and opportunity to talk to several veterans who gave up their careers and their lives to serve their country. And those who were left were basically either too young, too old for the draft, or were too injured. So you'd have guys that certainly couldn't play minor league ball under normal times playing Major League Baseball. So through that, a friend of mine who is also a great pirate historian and I got together and wrote this babble of about 800 pages of everything you want to know about the pirates, called the Pittsburgh Pirate Encyclopedia. And followed that up with a couple. We wrote one about the 79 Pirates, and have a recent book with Arcadia. People did this fine book on Squirrel Hill. Thank you very much. Honored to get here. So we have a book on the Pirates there. We've done a book on the Altoona Curve, and our latest is a collection of essays on the history of football in Western Pennsylvania that deals with everything from the birthplace of professional football to every college, to the Steelers, and even, you mentioned the Maulers in there, and that one fun season. But through it all, my one major love has been baseball. And even in bad times over the last 16 years, my kids have yet to see a winning team. Still love going down to the park, seeing Harold, and seeing as much baseball as I can. I'm assuming all of you are still diehard Pirate fans?
Yeah.
Best you can. Best you can. But anyways, it wasn't always that way. And actually, until these last 16 years, and except for a little bout in the 50s, it's been a pretty successful franchise. Even today, as bad as they've been over the last 16 years, there's still a couple hundred games over 500 in their career. But it has many great memories, many great moments that happened with this franchise. while the Pirates actually recognized 1887 as the beginning of their franchise, it actually started in 1882. There was a league called the American Association. It was an early day American league, rival to the National League. And it was a team called the Pittsburgh Alleghenies. And they were kind of slugging along, playing about 500, a little under 500. They had basically one star. His name was Ed Swartwood, who won the batting title in 1883, the first player in the franchise to win a batting title. And then in 1887, their owner also happened to be the president of the league, which is the ultimate conflict of duties. So he had a guy who signed with a team from Baltimore and happened to also sign with the Pirates. So they took it to arbitration, and of course he ruled for his own team. Other owners got a little mad. They fined the player $100 and suspended him for a year. A man named Denny McKnight, who was the owner of the Pirates, refused to tell the player he was suspended, and ended up taking his team to the National League in the dispute, and that's how the Pittsburgh Pirates ended up in the National League in 1887. Back then, there were a lot of very varied leagues because baseball until the 1970s was a very restrictive thing for the players. They had something called the reserve clause, which a team owned their rights through the end of their contract plus 1 year. Therefore, in essence, locking them into that team as long as they needed. There was no free agency. So through that, in the first couple of years, late years of the 19th century and the first couple decades of the 20th century, there were leagues would pop up that the players would start hoping to get a bigger piece of the pie. And this happened in Pittsburgh in 1890. And again, still the Alleghenies at that point. All the Pirates ended up going, or all the Alleghenies ended up going to a team called the Pittsburgh Stogies, leaving the franchise with a miserable 23-113 record. And it was so bad, they drew so few fans that literally their home games, they would go up and down the valleys in western Pennsylvania to play their home games because they drew so little attention in Pittsburgh. They were called the Innocents just because they were so young and bad. But they got through that season. The league called the Players League folded after a year, run very poorly. And all the teams went back to their organizations, and this is basically how the Pirates got to be known as the Pirates. There's a gentleman named Lou Bierbauer, who was a good second baseman, played with Philadelphia. At that point in time, Philadelphia had left him, through a clerical error, had left him off their protected list, which a couple players had done, and the owners figured, that's okay, you'll get your player back. Well, Pirates didn't see that, and they took this player, signed him. Philadelphia went nuts, threw up in arms, and they claimed that the Alleghenies pirated this player to their team, and thus the Pirates were born. So they didn't do really much through the 1800s. A couple decent years, and a couple nice players. A guy named Elmer Smith, a couple of Hall of Famers, Jake Beckley, Pud Galvin. A guy named Frank Killen, who was famous for two things. He's the last lefty in the National League to win 30 games. And he's also, back then, the mound was only 50 feet from home plate. Well, this guy threw so fast that they decided to move it back to 60 feet, 6 inches, what it is today, and they did it because of Frank Killen. So, he certainly was one of their better pitchers then, and a nice story because that's how baseball ended up with the mound distance. So towards the end, a lot of owners never really did much. Towards the end of the 19th century, National League decided to contract their teams. A guy who owned Louisville Colonels, by the name of Barney Dreyfus, who was elected to the Hall of Fame this year after being considered for so many years. He died in 32 or 33. But anyways, he had owned the Louisville Colonels. And on the Colonels were such players as Fred Clark, Thomas Wagner, Deacon Felipe, Claude Ritchie, a lot of guys that would end up coming to Pittsburgh and being the nucleus of the first true dynasty in the 20th century. But anyways, so the owner of the Cincinnati club was trying to purchase the Pirates at the time, and that fell through, so they decided to give the team to Dreyfus. Dreyfus traded all these players to Pittsburgh basically for a couple of hacks and a guy named Jack Cheeseborough, who he eventually took back with him once Louisville officially went out of business. So through this, they put together one of what would be and what continues to be, if you look at the statistics, one of the strongest teams in baseball history, the 1901 through 1903 Pirates. Actually, in 1900, they made their first postseason appearance after Dreyfus took over. It was, back then, the World Series consisted of the top two teams in the National League. It had been called the Temple Cup, but this one was called the Pittsburgh Sun-Telegraph, who sponsored the series at the time. They ended up losing to Brooklyn, but that was their first so-called World Series that they ever played in 1900. But in 1901, they ended up taking national pennant. 1902, I think it was 102 and 103 and 36. 103 and 36 was their record, which is one of the great records of all time. It takes this Pirate team quite a few years to get 103 wins. But back then, they did it all in 1 year, and certainly it stands as one of the greatest winning percentages of all time. Now, there was controversy about that. Some say that the American League that had just started and had been taking a lot of the National League teams, or players, had left Pittsburgh alone. So they'd have one team that was very good and everybody else would stink, so everybody would lose patience in the pennant race and lose interest. But as historians really researched it later on, they found that Barney Dreyfus was very much, while managers hated to work for him, the players kind of liked him early on in his tenure. He would be one of the few owners that actually would try to take care of his players, and they felt pretty loyal to him. And in fact, Honus Wagner had been offered quite a lucrative contract by, I believe, Washington of the American League, and stayed for much less money out of loyalty for Dreyfus because of the way he had treated them. But whatever it was, not many people went over to the American League until 1903 when the Pirates lost they lost Cheeseborough, who still holds the franchise modern record with 28 wins in 1902. And they lost a player named Jess Tannehill, who, an interesting story in 1902, Dreyfus was trying to find out if the players were being courted by the American League. So Tannehill had a tooth issue that he had to be taken care of. He was under anesthesia, and apparently Dreyfus sent a man in who asked him all sorts of questions, and under anesthesia he spilled his guts. So that's he ended up taking care of a few of the players, but Tannehill, unfortunately, yes, exactly, figuratively. But so, anyways, that's how he kind of found out who the AL was kind of targeting. But he took care of those guys and let Tannehill go off to the AL. But even though they had a couple defections, they still won a third consecutive pennant in 1903. Well, they had decided, the American League and the National League were kind of trying to put their spats to bed, so to speak. So they came up with an agreement to kind of cease the war of the free agents and sign an agreement that they would respect the contracts of the different teams. And they also came up with the idea of the World Series. The World Series was played Pittsburgh and Boston, called the American. And Pittsburgh was considered a vastly superior team to the Americans, and it wasn't thought to be too much before Pittsburgh would end up winning the series quickly. It was a best of 9 series that year, so there had to be 5 games instead of 4. Well, Pittsburgh broke out to a quick 3-1 advantage, but they had a couple problems. They had their top pitcher, Sam Lever, was injured. And another guy who was one of their better pitchers during 1902 and 1903 by the name of Ed Doheny, who basically became paranoid, had to be put in a straitjacket, stuck a poker chest in the nurse, and ended up being put away for the rest of his life after that. So, therefore, they didn't have his use in the World Series that year, so they were a little short on pitching. that in fact, Hannes Wagner did not actually have his best series, hitting in the 220s, I believe, 226 that series. And the Pirates ended up losing the next 4 games and unfortunately lost the first World Series ever. Well, that stigma unfortunately stuck with Wagner. He went on to win 8 batting titles, 7 RBI titles, become what is still considered today one of the top 10 players of all time, by far and away the top player ever put on a Pirate uniform, at least in my eyes. But he still always had that one thing. The Sporting News called him yellow. The Post-Gazette or Sun-Telegraph at the time questioned his courage. And it took Hannes, unfortunately, 6 years to relieve himself of that burden. The Pirates, again, winning the pennant in 1909 after almost capturing it in a 3-way, very exciting pennant race in 1908 between them and the Giants and the Cubs. People mostly hear about the Giants and the Cubs in that pennant race, but it was in fact the Pirates that only finished a game behind, and actually, I want to say a week before, had a chance in a series against the Cubs to take the pennant. But in 1909, they opened Forbes Field. They had played in Exposition Park, which is located, the good people of SABR, the Society of American Baseball Research, had found located the exact home plate, which is in the parking lot between Heinz Field and PNC Park.
In front of the Clark game.
Yeah, right, in front of the Clark building. And the problem with Exposition Park at the time was it was near the river, and when the river would flood, the water would come into the outfield. So during its tenure, there were lots of ground rules that they had to make to satisfy the water that would come up. So problematic was the area. The Pirate manager, Fred Clark, who was their greatest manager, but is a Hall of Famer because he was also one of the great left fielders of all time, he was quite an inventor too. He devised a pulley system to pull a tarp over that was a rudimentary thing of what we use today to pull the tarps over the field. But the first one was devised by Fred Clark, who also devised the flip-down smoke glasses or sunglasses that are used in baseball today, that are attached to the regular glasses. But they had a lot of problems with that, but they decided to move into this majestic new building, the first concrete stadium ever built in America, and was considered the jewel of American stadiums in 1900. So they opened that up midway during the season. The Pirates ended up beating the Cubs by 6.5 games. And Hannes Wagner would get his second shot at getting that monkey off his back, so to speak. So he went in against a man named Ty Cobb, the Georgia Peach, who certainly is also considered one of the top 5 players in the game today, if not one of the, right after Ruth, you probably have to consider Cobb one of the next 2 or 3 great players of all time. So Cobb, this was in sports, and actually this is the book we're just starting to research right now. In sports, right now, these championships are theaters. They pit one star against another. This was the first time that you can really say a championship event had that kind of theater to it. And it was more than that. Wagner was considered, by all accounts, a great gentleman, a great sportsman, somebody you want your children to be like. And Cobb was the exact opposite. Cobb was a jerk, reportedly killed a man, and at the time, he didn't know if he could get to Pittsburgh for the World Series because he had slashed a hotel detective in Cleveland, and during a fight because the elevator operator wouldn't take him up to his room because the elevator was closed after midnight. So Cobb had to figure out a way to get to Pittsburgh without going through Ohio, because if he went through Ohio, he was going to get arrested and thrown in jail. So he mapped out a train route that went through Canada, down Buffalo, and into Pittsburgh. But instead of doing that, he ended up going under in a car owned by his uncle, under a blanket, and made the trip from Detroit through Pittsburgh right there. Because I guess that route was a little bit of a pain in the butt. So Cobb also had been in 2, he had been in the previous 2 World Series without him, but he played poorly in the first one, and I don't think really cared one way or another whether he played good or bad in that series, like Wagner did. I mean, Wagner took it with him because he thought he left his teammates down, whereas Cobb was more or less not really liked by his teammates. In fact, there's a story in the early 1900s, him and another Hall of Famer named Napoleon Lajoie were going for a batting title. And he was so hated around the league, the name of the team who he was playing with, that they were playing with escapes me, but they were throwing the pretty much lollipops to the guy who was in the batting race with them, so he would get the hits and Cobb would lose the batting title. But, I mean, this was a guy that was despised, so you basically had good and you had evil going head-to-head against each other in this contest. And it was a decent series. It was back and forth. You know, pretty much every other game went to a seventh game. And as big as those two players were, it was actually a rookie from Tipton, Indiana by the name of Babe Adams, the original Babe, who was the guy that stole the show. He started the first game. He was an older rookie, 27, which was an older rookie for any time. But he ended up having a decent season. And he got the tip reportedly from the National League president, who said it reminded him of a style of a pitcher named Dolly Gray, who was a pitcher with the Washington Senators, or the Washington Nationals at the time, who pitched against Detroit earlier in the year and had shut him down over 18 innings. Some historians discount that because Dolly Gray was a very poor pitcher, and wondered whether Clark would really care if a guy who lost 18 games that year would be successful against the Tigers. But whatever it was, he started the rookie. He had a lot of 20-game people, Howie Kamnitz, Vic Willis, at his disposal, but he decided to go with this rookie, and this rookie ended up winning 3 games in the series, leading the Pirates to their first World Championship ever. And Honest Wagner had a sparkling series, hit over 300, a couple clutch hits, good defense, and Wagner and Cobb stunk the joint out. So in this one, good triumphed over evil, and the Pirates would end up winning their first championship. Unfortunately, after that first decade where they won 4 National League titles, came the first dynasty in the 20th century in baseball. The players got kind of old, as what happened to the Steelers in the early 80s. They stayed a little loyal to the great players a little too long. Dreyfus, who back then the owners were their own general managers, he made some questionable moves, some questionable trades, brought in some young talent that never came to fruition, and the good times came to an end pretty quickly. As they ended the 1910s, it even got bad to the point where he hired a manager by the name of Hugo Bezdek. And the weird thing about this guy was he was a West Coast scout for him, but he actually was a football coach with Oregon and Arkansas, and never had baseball managing experience. So it was a real questionable hiring. And baseball fans around the area, I guess, reading some of those articles back then, they got a little frustrated, just like they do now when these Pirates do something stupid. But he ended up being a good leader of men. He had, luckily, Bill McKechnie and another guy by the name of Casey Stengel were players against. So he actually would talk with them on a bench about baseball strategy. You know, as a good leader will do, he wasn't above taking suggestions from his men. And the Pirates ended up turning themselves around and becoming a plus 500 team under this guy before his tenure. He only managed 2 years. And then he took a job as Penn State's football coach, taking Penn State to the Rose Bowl, being elected to the College Football Hall of Fame. And then later in his career, he coached for the Cleveland Rams of the NFL, which makes him, the trivia question, the only man ever to manage baseball and coach in the NFL. So, you know, it was that quizzical move of a manager that ended up turning the Pirates around. And of course, the 1920s would come in and they'd be winners. But I mean, a couple other things happened in the 1910s. There's a guy. They say baseball's most unbreakable record is Joe DiMaggio's consecutive hitting streak. But in reality, The most unbreakable record happened in 1912 for the Pirates by a guy named Owen Chief Wilson, who hit 36 triples in one season in 1912. Now, the reasons this won't be broken, it's a great record. It's never, the nearest thing since then has been 24. It's happened a couple times, and I think Kansas City Royals' Willie Wilson at 22 or 23 in the 1980s, and that was the closest the modern player has come to it. So it's never even been challenged. And of course, the reason for it is ballparks back then were spacious. They weren't generally confined to a wall 400 feet away. So if you hit balls in certain ballparks, and Forbes Field was one of those at the time, you know, the ball would go 500 feet, and you could get triples. In today's ballpark, it's tough to get a triple because they're so confined. So literally, that's why we contended in our book that, say what you want, a guy can still hit 57, have a 57-game hitting streak in baseball, but nobody's ever going to hit 36 triples. So you had that. But anyways, 1920s, Pirates signed some guys. Kai Kyler, the only brother team in the Baseball Hall of Fame, the Weiner brothers. A guy named Pie Trainer came to the Pirates. Max Carey, who played for him in the late 1910s, really came into his own. He's a Hall of Fame center fielder, and one of the all-time leading stolen basemen in baseball. Certainly was the best at stealing bases at the time. So they had gotten a great collection of talent together. And in 1925, after 16 years, Dreyfus put together yet another championship team. They went to play the Washington Senators in the World Series that year, and were facing the great Walter Johnson in Game 7. They had gone down 3-1 in that series, and battled back, which they would do again some 74 years later. But they battled back, tied it up at 3, and faced the greatest, arguably the greatest pitcher in baseball history, in Walter Johnson in Game 7. Well, a couple things happened that day. There was a driving rainstorm, which, by all accounts, I can't imagine why they continued to play. There was a deluge coming down. They had to continually stop the game, bring out sand to the mound, and try to do what they can to keep the field playable. Pirates got down early, I want to say 7-3, and ended up scoring 7 runs in the last 2 innings of that Game 7. Battling back in one of, I can only imagine, one of the greatest games until, again, another game played 35 years later, another Game 7 in 1960. But to that point, one of the greatest Game 7s ever. They battled back. Kyler hit a very, what is considered a very controversial double in the 9th inning with the bases loaded. The ball in a driving rainstorm stuck under a tarp. Some guys questioned whether it was foul. I know Washington's Goose Goslin, till his dying days, claimed the ball was foul, but in the driving rainstorm, I guess you couldn't really tell. The umpires couldn't really tell it at that point. But anyways, it was called fair. Double came in, runners scored, Pirates scored 3 runs in the inning, won the game 9-7, and won their second world championship. The year after, unfortunately, there was Fred Clark, who had been their manager, became quite a wealthy man by that time. Had a little stake in the Pirates, and decided he wanted to sit on the bench and help Bill McKechnie, who was another Hall of Fame manager, coach. Well, their center fielder, Max Carey, was kind of aging at that time, and Clark kind of overruled him and was yelling at the manager to get Carey out of the game. Manager didn't seem to appreciate it. The players didn't appreciate it. 3 of them came up, the Babe Adams, Max Carey, and another decent player they had, Carlos Bigby. Complained to management about Clark, wanting him off the bench, and unfortunately those people were exited from the team along with the manager McKechnie after the season. It's what's called the ABC incident, but they still had enough talent left, because those guys were kind of aging at the time, except for Bigby. But they still had enough talent left to win the 27 championship a couple years later. Unfortunately, on the American League side, Murderers Row and the New York Yankees also won the pennant in the American League, and basically made very short work of the Pirates in that World Series, sweeping them in 4 straight games. As the Pirates ended up being a trivia question, who did the greatest team in baseball history, or so people call them, would beat in the World Series. But that was pretty much the end for the Pirates winning championships for a while. They had a decent, Lloyd Wainer was a rookie in 27, at 355. Paul was an established player. Pie Traynor, who took over as manager in the 30s, was certainly still a great player, but they never had enough. They had some good teams, but never enough to put them over the top. Luckily for baseball fans in the area, I don't know how many actually went to see him, but they did get to see championship baseball during the 30s, in the way of Pittsburgh Crawfords and the Homestead Grays, our 2 Negro League teams during that time period. The Crawfords put together with a man named Gus Greenlee, who was a numbers runner. He was in with the bosses of Pittsburgh at the time, and made a nice bit of money. Basically signed every great Negro Leaguer player there was. His 1935 team is considered one of the great Negro League, the greatest Negro League team of all time, if not one of the greatest in baseball history. That team actually had the likes of Josh Gibson, Cole Papa Bell. These are all Hall of Fame players. You had Oscar Charleston, Judy Johnson, Satchel Paige, the great Satchel Paige. Although people credit him with being on the 35 team, he actually, that was the one year he didn't play. He was here in 34 and 36 when they won titles. But in 35, he had gone on to play barnstorming baseball, which basically he would take a team, go from city to city, and that's basically how baseball players would supplement their salaries back then. Page did that for the year that year, but he certainly played on 2 of those teams. Josh Gibson, probably next to Wagner, along with Wagner, probably the greatest player in Pittsburgh sports history, baseball player. Some say if he had played Major League Baseball, he would have crushed Babe Ruth's all-time home run record. He was credited with over 900 home runs in his career, but a lot of those came in small ballparks against lesser competition, so it's tough to really tell how many he would have had, but from all accounts, he would have been one of the great home run hitters of all time. And then you had the Grays, who won 8 consecutive Negro League championships between 1937 and 1945, who also conversely had a lot of their players on that team. Basically, Greenlee had signed all those players away. Unfortunately, in the late 30s, new mayor was hired, was more interested in cleaning up the streets than being bribed by him, so Greenlee was out of business, and therefore the Crawfords were out of business. But the Homestead Grays certainly were staples through the end of the Negro League days, winning those 8 consecutive titles. But the Pirates kind of floundered, had a chance in 1938, had the pennant so-called almost wrapped up with when their owner, Bill Benswanger, built a press box above Forbes Field to house the many press that was expected for the 1938 World Series. The Pirates kind of choked down the stretch, and in a game late in the year, next to the last game of the year against the Cubs in Wrigley, in the fading light of a long game, their ace reliever, Mace Brown, hung a curveball that Hall of Fame catcher for the Cubs, Gabby Hartnett, whacked out, winning the game for him 6-5, and unfortunately losing the Pirates' pennant chances in 1938 with that game. But they had their opportunities. Actually, there was a report in the late 30s that a man named Chester Washington, who was a writer with the Pittsburgh Courier, had offered the Pirates, had supposedly got these players together, and he said the Pirates could sign Josh Gibson, Ray Brown, who one of the great pitchers in Negro League history, Buck Leonard, Papa Bell, and Satchel Paige, which, had that happened, would have made the Pirates the New York Yankees of the 1930s and 40s. They would have won several pennants with a lineup like been considered one of the great dynasties of all time. But unfortunately, the commissioner of baseball, Judge Landis, who was very much against signing African Americans at the time, would have never allowed that to happen. And quite frankly, I don't know that the Pirates would have had the guts to pull off such a thing and fight him, such as Brain Tricky did with Jackie Robinson in 1945. But it's kind of a neat little fact that when you think about what those teams would have done had they had access to them, and certainly with the most talented players in Pittsburgh were in the Negro Leagues, so that would have been something to see those players playing for the Pirates at Forbes Field. But years went on, the 40s came the war. The Pirates were kind of one of the beneficiaries of the war. They had probably out of all the teams, they had the fewest players drafted. So they ended up having some decent winning teams during that time period. Even the Army did one. That's basically what's it. But I mean, that time was just so fascinating. How, I mean, you try to imagine the players of today. Just a lot of these players didn't wait to get drafted. Hank Greenberg, who we'll talk about in a second, was one of the great hitters of all time. With the Detroit Tigers was at his prime in 1940 and 41 when he left right before Pearl Harbor. Signed up with the Army to do his part, and actually was due to be released and released back to the Tigers when Pearl Harbor happened. So then he was brought back and ended up there. Bob Feller, one of the great pitchers in baseball history, enlisted, leaving his career behind. Ted Williams, Lord knows what records he would have set had he not just done one stint in the war. He did two. He did a stint in Korea also. And even with that, hit over 500 homers. I mean, no doubt he would have been closing in on Babe Ruth's record before Barry Bonds was even around when he came up. So, I mean, you have a lot of great stories, a lot of great minor. Only a couple major leaguers lost their lives during it, but a lot of minor leaguers lost their lives doing it. A lot of guys who would have come down and become great major league players. There's a guy from Kings Rocks by the name of John Pinder who was a good player in the minors. He was a radio man, and he went to Normandy during the D-Day invasion. And the radio men were, I mean, among the most important. They were the communicators. So he was shot in the leg. Radio was still on the boat, and he knew if he didn't get that radio, his troop was going to be devastated. So he ran back, shot in the back a couple times, turned around, picked up the radio, shot in his face, held his face as he went back to bring the radio, put it together, shot again right as he came, and got that radio together, had somebody communicate it, and unfortunately died at that point. But I mean, there are just so many stories about that time, just fascinating people. Who certainly gave up their careers at that time. But after that, the war ended. The Dreyfus family sold their interest to the Galbraiths, who certainly were well known as the great owners of the Pirates in the 60s and 70s. But back then, they were as reviled as Kevin McClatchy's group is now, because they had put together the lousiest teams the city has ever seen. They made Hank Greenberg the first $100,000 man in the National League. He was well past his career, and while he hit 25 homers, mostly because they had built a fence in front of the Forbes left field wall called Greenberg Garden, so it was a little easier to hit home runs. But what he did do was he taught a young man by the name of Ralph Kiner how to be a major leaguer. At one point, Ralph was suffering in his first year, and they were going to send him back down. Greenberg reportedly talked him out of it, and Kiner came up and ended up leading majors in home runs over 7 consecutive years, which certainly is a record, got him to the Hall of Fame. He was a great player on bad teams. Pirates were one of the leaders in attendance solely because of Kiner. Those of you who are fans at that point probably remember Forbes Field draining out of people after Kiner had his last at bat because the team was so lousy there was no other reason to watch him. But they ended up bringing in, they wasted a lot of money, brought in the great Branch Rickey, the man who built the Dodgers and Cardinals into powerhouses, built this team into a powerhouse. Now, first thing Rickey did with Korea coming up, he thought it was going to be the same thing as World War II, so he tried to staff his team with aging veterans and players too young to be drafted. And of course, it didn't happen that way, so the Pirates ended up with just bad older players and bad younger players. And we're one of the worst teams in baseball history because of it. I mean, even though we've lost more consecutive seasons now than they did then, I'd take these teams over those teams any day. Those were just bad, horrid teams. Post-Gazette would constantly rag on Rickey, claiming he wasted $2 million over the course of trying to sign bad veterans. But what he doesn't get credit for is the minor leaguers he ended up bringing into the system, who unfortunately didn't play well, or didn't play with the major league team for the most part when he was there. There's a Latin American right fielder who the Dodgers were trying to hide in their farm system, who wasn't protected in the draft, so they would. Some say they wouldn't play him because scouts were in the crowd scouting him. They would have him throw with the pitchers during pregame practice to try to hide him a little bit, but the Pirates were able to kind of get him. His name was Roberto Clemente. So they got him. They got Dick Rose, Roy Face, Bobby Del Greco, who was kind of still kind of mini celebrity in the area, but he's more famous because he was the trade bait to get a center fielder by the name of Bill Verdon from the Cardinals. Signed Bob Friend, Frank Thomas, Vern Law, Bob Skinner, Ronnie Klein, and Nellie King. Now, for the most part, that group ended up growing up a little bit. And while Branch Rickey was relieved of his duties in 1955 in favor of another great Pirate GM, Joel Brown, those players would kind of stick around a little bit and ended up being part of a nice story in 1960, for which we have the 1960 expert here. Brown hired a man named Danny Murtaugh, former second baseman with the Pirates and Phil. Ended up being like a real death knell for any Pittsburgh manager from 1958 through 1976. Murtaugh kept retiring because he had heart issues, and every time he'd retire, the guy who would take his place, Murtaugh would be the one who eventually would be coming up to take the managerial reins from that guy. So it happened with Harry Walker, happened with Larry Shepard, Bill Verdon, and pretty much every I think that was it. But those were the managers that replaced Danny Murtaugh between 1958 and 1976. But Murtaugh was a great leader, great manager, certainly a guy in my estimation should get more consideration for the Hall of Fame for what he did. But he brought the team together in 1958. They finished in second place. 59, a little disappointing, but still over 500. And then in 1960, probably the dream seasons of dream seasons. Led by, I want to say 35 times they came back in their last at bat to win. They had a very underrated, great pitching and bullpen, timely hitting in their bench. And while you can't really look down and say this was a team that was speckled with Hall of Famers, it was certainly what a true team was. I mean, every guy did their part. Every guy had a hand in winning that championship, and they went into the World Series against what was considered one of the great dynasties of all time in the Yankees. What were the scores that the Yankees won their World Series games?
12-0, 10-0, and 16-3. They outscored the Pirates 38-3.
In the three Yankee games. Now, the Pirates, when they were winning, they were nip and tucking, just finding ways to eke out games. Took it to a final game. I'm sure if you're all baseball fans, you know what happened in that final game. Hal Smith brought the Pirates back with a home run in the 8th inning, and Pirates were up 9-7. Hal Smith could have been the man who was known as the great hero of the 1960 team, except the Yankees put 2 runs in the top of the 9th against the Pirates, and led to a man named Bill Mazeroski coming up at what time? 3:36 on October 13th. And hit what is today still the only 7th game, inning-ending, series-ending home run in baseball history. And anybody that says any other home run is the greatest in Major League history is full of fun, because there can be no greater home run than one that wins a World Series. For years, it was probably something that kept Mazeroski out of the Hall of Fame, thinking that was what he was most famous for. But in reality, he was the greatest defensive second baseman in history. And when doing research for this, we actually found out he had more hits than any National League second baseman during the 60s, during his decade. So he was quite a fine hitter who, if he wasn't playing in the vast confines of Forbes Field, actually would have been one of the better hitters in baseball during that time. But that park kind of sapped a lot of stats out of people. It sapped his. Willie Stargell ended up with 475 homers, and one can only figure if he played at Three River Stadium his whole career, would have been well into the 500s by the time he was through with his career. But anyways, it was a fabulous victory. The city was lit up. Probably the only major controversy on that team was Grote won the MVP, being injured the last month of the season for all intents and purposes, and the great Roberto Clemente finished 7th or 8th. Yeah, it was 7th or 8th that league. Roberto was so bitter that rather than wear his 1960 ring, he wore his All-Star ring, because he wasn't necessarily mad that he lost the MVP to Grote. He was mad that he finished 8th. And that was what Clemente had to go through during that time period. Obviously, the Jackie Robinson saga, people are well aware of what he had to go through as the first African American in baseball. But Clemente had it worse. Clemente not only was a man of color, he was also a man who was of a foreign land, so he was not well understood. So he really had and if you read some of the articles, they tried to quote him phonetically, which irritated him to no end. Sports writers made fun of him, and Clemente really was cast as a whiner, a bad guy, not a team player. If you listen to some of the interviews of the guys he played with in the 60s, he's not thought of in good terms. I mean, Mazeroski, who he played literally every year with him, Maz retired the year Clemente unfortunately died. Maz, you never get the warm and fuzzy feeling for Maz about Clemente. But nonetheless, he certainly through the 60s was one of the great underrated players in baseball history. But the Pirates never could seem to capture that magic. They had some great years in the 60s, but they tried to add that one piece with Jim Bunning and Marty Wills, but never seemed to work. But they turned to their minor league system in the late 60s, which on one minor league team you had Al Oliver, Freddie Potek, Richie Hebner, Manny Sanguillen, Bobby Robertson, Doc Ellis, Bobby Moose, guys that would end up being the players, the core players that would take the Pirates to that next level in the 70s when they brought them up. Now, Clemente now surrounded with, Pirates were one of the aggressive people with Latin American players during that time period. They had a lot of players of color at that point. And all of a sudden, Clemente felt a little more comfortable in the locker room and turned from a guy who was not considered much of a player into a great leader with that team. great leader that helped take that team to a Eastern League division title in 1970, and basically in the national spotlight took the team on his back in the 1971 World Series with just a great performance. I mean, he was a true clutch performance. He hit in all 14, had a hit in all 14 World Series games he played, and that game, including Game 7, where he hit the home run that put the Pirates ahead for good, just made him all of a sudden a national spotlight, and he was a 37-year-old player at the time. So basically what they were all saying is the nation now knew what Pittsburgh, one of the greats in the history of the game, would reside in Pittsburgh in right field. Next year he gets exactly the amount of hits he needed to get 3,000. Last regular season game he played. Only player in Pittsburgh history to get 3,000 on with the Pirates. And unfortunately, while trying to, there was an earthquake in Nicaragua. So Clemente was very emotional. He kept trying to send stuff there. They had the Sandinista government, who was in charge then, was taking the goods from the people and selling it on the black market. Clemente didn't want any of this, so he basically wanted to go on a plane with the goods, a plane that was not equipped for flying at the time, a plane that was loaded with too much stuff. But he wanted to go there, he wanted to personally make it. It would literally be like you and me going down to the Kremlin in the heyday of the great Russian Empire and saying to Khrushchev, you get out of my way, I'm taking this stuff to your people. I mean, that's how gutsy this move was that Clemente was trying to do. Such a humanitarian, and unfortunately, the plane crashed. Clemente was never found, and he remains today far and away the biggest sports icon the city has ever known. As we were researching that, there's more schools and bridges named for him in this country than any United States president, which is a mind-boggling fact. And still in Puerto Rico, he's considered the elite of elites, the greatest human being ever come out of there. But anyways, I mean, he certainly passed away, and the team, its foundation was crushed. Steve Blass that year also got his famous Steve Blass disease, where he all of a sudden went from being one of the great pitchers to not being able to find the plate anywhere. The ball sometimes would fly over the head of the catcher, would fly every which way, and Blass unfortunately was out of the game after that season, after a stint of trying to find his way back in Charleston, which they would let him, when he wasn't pitching, hook up with an announcer by the name of Laney Fratteri with Charleston, forming one of the great announcing duos that still luckily remain today, with Blass and Fratteri announcing for the Pirates. But the team was crushed. Murtaugh came back after '73 and did get him to the playoffs, did win the East in '74 and '75. I mean, you could tell they weren't of world championship caliber. Reds pretty much took them one year. The Dodgers took them in '74 fairly easily. And, the team had kind of fallen a little bit back, but being serious World Series contenders. Until the Pirates sent Manny Sanguillen to the Oakland A's for a man by the name of Chuck Tanner, who came back along with some fortuitous trades by their new general manager, Harding Peterson, who brought Phil Garner in, Tim Foley, and a man in 1979 by the name of Bill Madlock to go with their aging star Willie Stargell, who had one last day in the sun in 1979, and Dave Parker, who was baseball's first $1 million man and the best in the game at that point. And the Pirates made another run through the National League that year, kind of nipping the Montreal in the last week to win the East fairly closely. And certainly, I was a freshman at Duquesne University that year, and one of the songs I hated the most was "We Are Finoli." Now, I got very bad grades that first semester because I was down at the stadium just about every night with my ears closed, listening to that song. But I mean, that team fought back, down 3-1 in the series. Talked to Jim Brooker once. He was at a Sabre meeting talking about it. He said the scouts had given him every wrong piece of information that on Baltimore pitching, so they decided to do the complete opposite of what the Pittsburgh scouts were telling them to do. And they ended up instead of giving up 2 runs in the last 3 games. Becoming the first team since the 25 Pirates to come back down 3-1. And we went down to Market Square, celebrated, thought, this is a great team. We'll be down here more often in the next couple of years. And you know, I'm still waiting 20-some years later, almost 30 years later, to go back down there. The team wasn't as good. To get that team together, Harding Peterson pretty much emptied out his great farm system, so there was nothing left there. Unfortunately, a lot of Pirates kind of got hooked into the Pittsburgh drug trials. It was pretty much a black day for Pittsburgh baseball in the early 80s. The team was looking like it was going to leave. Mayor Caligiuri put together a group of people, which was the precursor to the modern day group of owners that is so prevalent in sports. They put together a group, bought the Pirates from the Gallagher for $25 million. Hired Joe Brown back to kind of empty out all the dead wood. Brought in a wild guy by the name of Sid Thrift to run the organization. Making some great trades, the great April's Fool trades, which people whined about when he got rid of the great Tony Pena for angry outfielder by the name of Andy Van Slyke, a little used fat catcher by the name of Mike LaValliere, and pitcher by the name of Mike Dunn. And certainly Mike Dunn had a good year, but the other two ended up being 2 staples of the Pirate championship teams that would grow in the early 90s. Again, we had great, nice drafts, which brought Barry Bonds, Bobby Bonilla, who they stupidly let go through the minor league Rule 5 draft, and then had to go get him back from the White Sox after he broke up with the White Sox. I think his leg or his wrist, but anyways, they traded him back to the Pirates and got a guy by the name of Doug Drabeck from the Yankees, who became their 2nd Cy Young winner, and a little-known manager from the Tigers farm system by the name of Jim Lehman, who turned into one of the great managers in modern-day baseball, and it all worked, and the Pirates put together 3 consecutive championships in the 90s. You know, we don't want to remember that last playoff game they were in against Atlanta, the darkest day in my sports watching. Sat in front of the TV for an hour, not knowing whether to throw something into it or not. But, you know, at that point in time, the Pirates had a decision to sign Andy Van Slyke or Barry Bonds. Well, they signed Andy Van Slyke. Barry Bonds went on to greatness with San Francisco, and we haven't made too many good decisions since then. Team was almost again out of the city. Kevin McClatchy came to the rescue with his team, buying it for $90 million. And as bad as he was as an owner, he certainly has to be always credited with not only saving the team, but putting together what is the finest single facility in baseball. Is not just dubbed by Pittsburgh fans, but national fans and USA Today, in fact, claims still today it's the best place to watch a baseball game. But as the team goes, and certainly if we're fans of lately, we all know what happens after that. The story gets bad. The team gets excited because it comes close to winning a division, even though it's below 500 in 1997. But unfortunately, that's the high point. The expectations went from playoffs to, bite my tongue, if we finish 500, all of a sudden we're supposed to have a parade in the streets. You know, I mean, team minor leagues are pretty few and far between of talent. It's a decent lineup, but you know, we're still about 3-4 years away. But so far, I guess you gotta like what you've seen. I mean, they haven't done a bad job, the new ownership group, putting a lot of money, had a nice draft, a lot of money into the Latin American territories to try to get some players out of there. But you know, it is my enduring wish just to see one more playoff, and see an important game in September. So hopefully, you know, as the rain comes down, ironically, as we talk about. But you know, ironically, that signing of Barry Bonds, which certainly would have meant more winning baseball for the Pirates in the 90s, certainly they suffer with today. And hopefully, through it all, we get to see in a couple of years a playoff contender, but boy, it doesn't look like it, does it?
Okay.
Well, we can all dream. Every spring training, my buddy I wrote the book with, he asked me how I think they're going to do because he knows I'm going to give him scenarios on how they can end up competing for the division title, and then he laughs at me for the next 6 months. And it reminds me daily. So, but anyways, that's it. That's a Pittsburgh time. As I said, we have this book. It's $25 in the bookstores, but I have them here for $20. It basically has everything you want to know about Western Pennsylvania football, and certainly covers just about. In fact, there's a nice thing. My favorite thing. We ended up making a book out of it, a separate book. How the city of Latrobe basically butchered and botched getting the Hall of Fame. They had the Hall of Fame in Latrobe and fought and argued for 12 years, and eventually a guy from Canton came in and secured the rights for Canton, and still today the guys in their historical society have this little ire in their eyes when you mention it, and they think of the hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue that Canton gets every year that they don't.
What year was that?
They got it in the 1940s, and basically they had the plans. They couldn't raise. Back then, the NFL was, I mean, it was a peon of leagues, and didn't have the money to build it itself. So it was up to the city to raise the money. So they would argue they didn't want to ruin the scenic lifestyle that Latrobe claimed to have, and they would argue back and forth, and nobody would come up with the money. They had these great plans. In fact, the stadium that the high school team plays in was built out of what money they had, which was supposed to be for NFL teams to come and play exhibition games in. And then they had the plans for the Hall of Fame at the end of it, which is now a pool. But they basically fought about it for 12 years, never came up with the money. In 1960, the NFL, at that point, they still thought Latrobe was the birthplace of professional football, because none of the players who played that, because it was considered heresy for some reason to be paid to play football, even though nobody minded that people were being paid to play baseball. But they all were steadfast, wanted their amateur status. So nobody would ever admit to it except one guy from Latrobe by the name of John Brailer, who admitted he got $10 in, I want to say 1895 to play football. So, as the story goes, eventually the National League, Football League got sick of waiting. They put it up for bid in 1960. Art Moody tried very much to get the National League, Football League to agree to Latrobe, but the Timken Company in Canton came up with a huge amount of money, built the Hall of Fame.
Can you say something about the voice of the Pirates, Rosie Rosewell, Bob Prince?
Oh, sure. Rosie Rosewell, certainly the Pirates were famous that they were, had the first radio broadcast, Harold Arlen. The year escapes me, it was in the 1920s, but KDK had the first baseball broadcast. And they've had some of the great voices in baseball history. Rosie Rosewell, certainly, he wrote a fabulous book of poetry. He was certainly a very talented man, very colorful man. Was their first grade announcer, and arguably one of the first grade announcers in baseball history. Very colorful man, had calls, open the window, Aunt Minnie, every time a home run, and then the fake noise of a window breaking as the ball would go through. But I mean, he was a great homer. Very much pro Pirates. I mean, today it's not considered in good taste to be a homer when you're announcing, but I mean, personally, that's why I kind of prefer Greg Brown, because it gives you that feeling of a homer. You like that guy root for your team. And so Rosie Rosewell was certainly the first great guy named from, went to several schools, last being Oklahoma, great swimmer, but certainly a bit of a wise ass, so to speak, by the name of Bob Prince. Became Rosie Rosewell's man in waiting, so to speak. His second was second in the booth, and he was basically his gopher when he started. Learned how to announce the game. Learned his art from Rosewell in his short tenure. When Rosewell passed away, Prince took over. certainly became one of the most colorful, great announcers in sports history. I mean, never mind Pittsburgh. Was a homer, bar none. When he would do national broadcast, when he did the '71 broadcast, I didn't like hearing on it because he kept trying to be so neutral. It was starting to irritate me, but I mean, he was one of the great fans. Certainly colorful stories about him, from his hotel room to a pool on a bit. Considered quite the social man, always at the bar with a story, but I mean, he was Pittsburgh. There was controversy, and I was still a young Pirate fan at the time during the end of his tenure, where he would, you'd go into stories where Lord knows it'd be a half hour before you found out what was going on in the game, because he was one of these great stories. But still with that, I mean, it was interesting as hell to listen to. And 74, 75, it was decided he would be fired. And still remains one of the great rumblings from fans in Pittsburgh sports history who didn't want to see it happen. I remember the great ban of Iron City beer. People were boycotting that, and caused quite a ruckus throughout it when they let go of him and King. He had a couple of tenures. He did Monday Night Baseball. You could see his heart wasn't into it. I mean, he kind of was listless doing it. Unfortunately, the Penguins hired him. He would go into and hockey is not a sport where you have the time to go into a story in the middle of the game. And he would do this, and then he would cut in. He didn't know the names, so he'd come in. They have it now. He has it now. They have it. And then he'd go into the story. And he'd come back 5 minutes later after goals. Oh, they scored. Okay. And it was kind of humorous, but sad at the same time. But luckily, my wife and I, we do include this in this book. Our first game, we were married in '85, and our first game as husband and wife was against the Dodgers as the Pirates rightfully brought Prince back into the booth. And the Pirates were bad that year, but somehow they just were the greatest team in baseball that night, won 16-2. Sorry, 16-2. And a couple weeks later, Prince died of throat cancer. But he had that one last moment. It still remains one of my most treasured moments in the Pirate game.
Wasn't that first inning that he broadcast that night, the Pirates scored 9 runs?
Yes, yes, it did. Yes, it did. They were in a bad stretch, and it was like, all of a sudden, this man brought up.
What kind of work did Barney Dragons do that they were able to buy in this?
He wasn't much more than just a office man. There wasn't a lot of money at that point in time in baseball. I don't know that he was any tremendous entrepreneur at the time. In fact, when he first had the Pirates, he was with a man named Kerr, who was the Pirates owner in the late 1800s, who was looking to sell part of his thing. Now, Kerr was an interesting character himself. He was the George Steinbrenner of baseball during that time period. He was a very feisty man who would basically cause stirs. Players hated him, managers hated him, but he really had no job that was of any consequence at the time. But he had Louisville. They did not do well. He kind of eased his way into the Pirates, and as the Pirates were successful, he would end up buying more and more of this Mr. Kerr's portion of the team until he fully owned the team in the early 1900s. But it wasn't a lot of money at that point in time that they were dealing with. Yes?
It was either 1949 or 1950 that they decided to make a movie.
It was in the outfield.
Yes,
Yeah.
but it started out being called Angels and Pirates because everybody knew that in order for the Pirates to win, it would have to be named a heavenly. And it was only the last minute that changed it to Angels.
That's a great point. I just saw that movie last week.
That was the second one. They made one back before the 90s, and they made it again not too long.
Oh, no, that's the one I saw, the one with Janet Leigh and Floyd. That I'm not sure.
I graduated in '51, and I was still graduated.
I mean, that's
so
the they put on, maybe you see it in the newspaper.
Yeah, oh, yeah, but it's, I won't watch the other one, because it's
No, not the new one, you know when they showed it the first time?
at the All-Star game, the
You
94,
remember
I
that?
remember that. Yes, ma'am.
Rip Soul
Yes.
and his
Blooper pitch,
ball.
the EFS pitch.
Yes, I have sort of a touching anecdotal that I was in the hospital with ruptured appendix. I was like between 9 and 10, and I got a phone call in the hospital, and it was Rip Soul because we knew Dr. Wagner, who was Hugh Wagner, who was the team doctor. And he said, with that strong southern accent, Dolby, instead of Dolly, it was Dolby. What would you like us to bring to the hospital? I said, a ball, a bat, a glove. And so what they did do was bring a ball. And it was signed by the whole team, including Hans Wagner.
Wow, still have it?
I have it here, you could look at it.
Oh, wow,
Yeah.
that's great.
But that was Rip Soul calling the hospital
Oh,
for
that's great.
this little girl. It was
That's a
something.
great story.
Yeah, so.
Yes.
Did the Galbraiths live in Squirrel Hill?
That, I'm not sure.
Okay, there's some rumors that
I
they
can check that out for you.
did. Yeah, I can
Can you
take.
check that out?
But I have another
They
more
did.
general question.
They lived
Everyone.
in Columbus their whole life.
What?
They lived in Columbus, Ohio their whole life.
Okay, all right, sorry. Everyone knows that Pittsburgh lives through its sports teams, different ones, different eras. Why?
Well, I'll tell you what, it is, you know, for the Joseph Horn Company, I was a buyer, and I was luckily able to travel throughout the country when I was there. This is one of the few places where it's like a small town community in a big town. And originally, it was through football, as I found out through this, that the steel towns would have their own football teams, would be emotional with their football teams, and the emotion of that sport kind of grew through that, grew through the Steelers and the colleges. But I think the main reason is you get that sense of town, sense of community more here. I mean, even when you go to, again, when we were researching this, we found that there were Steeler bars in just about every city in America, and you can't get a seat on Sundays. There's a place in Arizona, 1,200 people. My friend who I wrote this with went to the Fiesta Bowl, and Pitt was there a few years ago, in 2004, and he wanted to see the game. You couldn't get a reservation. There were 1,200 solid. You leave the city, they leave the city, but they never leave it in their heart. And everybody I've ever talked to who's moved away always said there's no place like here. It's safe, it's a great place to raise your children, and I think that sense of community just seems more aware here and more together. And you know, you take the team as your own because it's part of your community. And quite frankly, it's just fun. I mean, it's fun when the Penguins were playing in this. It's fun because everybody's a Penguin fan, and you know, we have a good time talking to everybody. And Steelers a couple years ago, but I think it's more than that, just more a sense of community here than anywhere I've ever seen. Yes.
It seems to me a fair number of pirates have ended up retiring around Pittsburgh, living here. I wonder if that's unusual in the major leagues.
I don't know if it's unusual, but it's certainly from the way you hear about how Pittsburgh is close to them and how they've adopted Dick Road, for example. You know, he was a native here, but I mean, he'll tell you about people, the Dave Justies and Manny St. Ian's and Steve Blasses and Talking Blass a few times. I mean, they'll all tell you that. Again, that's one thing they'll tell you talking about community, that they find it more here than anywhere they've ever been, and they love it. And you don't find that as much with the modern day player, just because they tend to retire to the exotic places and such. But yeah, I would say that probably, I mean, the Steelers, the great Steeler teams of the 70s and 80s are all still here, even though they're not natives. Yeah, I would say that's probably neat too. sports the way they are. I heard an interview with Dwyer and Harris the other day on ESPN, and that's basically what they were talking about, how they find just joy being in this area and living here. And they haven't found anywhere in their lives. Yes.
Why do they call it World Series? It's only in this country.
Well, this country is pretty much the only ones that play baseball. And back then, I mean, like the NFL and like the NBA do now, where they're trying to make it a more world game, taking their games to different countries, taking exhibition games to different countries. Back then, baseball actually was trying to do that. And there's a story in the late 1900s, the great owner, Richie Spalding, who owned the Chicago club and was a great sports entrepreneur who's there's still a Spalding company in his name, but he took the game to Egypt, trying to sell it to the Middle East. And of course, nobody cared. He lost a lot of money, but that's what they were trying to do back then, and they were boasting that the greatest players in the world play here. It's the World Series, and that's pretty much how it got started. But in reality, nobody else cared about the game. We were dealing with
It's
the
very
play.
popular in Japan today.
It is now. Oh yeah, it's very popular in Japan and Latin America, Mexico. So it's gaining its stronghold.
Let's take a couple more questions.
A comment, just a little story, and then I'm going to respond to Mike's question before. The story is not much of a story. Is I grew up in Chicago, a Chicago Cubs fan. By the way, talk about frustration. You love the Cubs, you hated the White Sox, and so on. But of course, I went to a lot of games, and I saw a number of Pirate games. And Stargell and Clemente would absolutely destroy the Cubs. I mean, it was just so many home runs. But Clemente hit the longest home run I ever saw. You think Clemente was a great hitter. You don't think of him as a real blaster. He hit a home run that, all the home runs go into Waveland Avenue, okay? Right down the left field line.
Right.
He hit one into Waveland Avenue that barely missed hitting the scoreboard. It was an unbelievable blast. It was.
That's a little known thing about Clemente is he hit what he needed. He hit what was best for the team. But when Harry Walker, I believe it was 66, told him to let loose, he had 29 homers in a time where there was 29 homers was a lot, and he showed he could, if need be, he could be that power hitter. So Clemente was a very unselfish player, but that's a good point. He had power.
Now, as far as responding to why Pittsburgh is so involved in sports, as an outsider, my view is that Pittsburghers are extremely defensive and can't believe when anything good happens. It's true. It's true. When the place is rated, calls Pittsburgh #1. That's front page headlines this big. We know it's a great place, but there's this feeling that nothing good can ever happen here. So that I think is why people really glom onto the importance of sports here.
Yeah, it's a point. That's a good point. That is true.
Also, part of it, I think, blue-collar steel workers would come home at night so exhausted that the best thing to do was grab your beer and watch a game. It was a way to unwind. We were the biggest steel city and the biggest blue-collar fan club. So I think that at least my uncles told me that.
Well, that's again how football got really big, was through that emotion of the steelworkers.
Yes.
That's the question.
You were talking, or someone mentioned before about the old-time ball players, retiring locally and so on. And you talk about ball players' influence on kids. I have to tell you this story. It happened to me in 1947. When Ken Greenberg was playing with the Pirates. My grandparents lived in Webster Hall Hotel, and all the visiting teams used to stay there because it was just 2 blocks from Ford's Field. And we were there for dinner one Sunday night, in the dining room, and there were a couple glass doors, and my grandmother, who at that time was, let's see, 58 years old, something like that. She said, "Oh, there's Hank Greenberg in the lobby." So I thought, well, there he was, and I said to my dad, "Can I get his autograph?" He said, "Sure." So he gave me a piece of paper and a pencil, and I went out in the lobby. Now, I was about 4'10", and he was 6'3" approximately. And he was standing with nobody around him. I walked up to him and I said, "Mr. Greenberg, could I have your autograph?" And he looked down at me and said, "Don't you think it would be nice to say please?" I said, "Could I please have your autograph?" He said, "Sure." And he just signed it. Now, here it is, 61 years later. And I still remember that. So I have always remembered always to say please and always to say but when you talk about the influence ball players, so, "Oh, I'm not a role model," you know, your parents are role models and so on and so forth. That's one thing. I heard somebody I never knew said that, and I remember it to this day. If he had not been Hank Greenberg, of course, I never would have walked out in the lobby, but that's the kind of influence those ball players have on kids.
Absolutely, and that was a good point. I mean, when I did my World War II book and interviewing more current guys for my pirate books, there's just such a vast difference between the manners and just respect. Those guys will give you of their time and their answers, and they're just a joy to talk to. And I can see how it would have been that way when we did.
Well, you know, players in that era, let's say the 60s on back, they are thrilled that people remember them.
Oh,
You know, people in their 30s and 40s, like, "Oh yeah, I heard about him, he played in whenever." But the people who were around them and saw them or watched them play, they're thrilled that people remember them.
I'll tell you what, they're interesting.
Thank you very much. When you think of some of the bad teams you have, Pittsburgh's still pretty lucky. I grew up down the road from Denver. Until 1970s or 80s, the team that we got was a radio broadcast, first from the Yankees and later from the Kansas City A's. That's all there was. Good night. Have a good audience.